Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is all about emotions and personality. So we're moving from motives and motivation, which is closely tied to emotions now, those things that we feel and experience. So emotions have at least three important components. The first is that they are associated with our own subjective feelings. Think about all the things that you can feel sort of inside of yourself, that we call emotions. Some are very basic, like sadness, that you feel it, and you can sometimes feel it in the pit of your stomach. Sometimes we call these affects. Affects is just another word for emotion or feeling state. But then some of them are more complex, like jealousy, where we feel that in a different way, but we subjectively feel it, and we can label it that. These are accompanied by bodily changes, mostly in the nervous system. So think central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Certainly there are changes there, but then also your peripheral nervous system, which is everything else, mostly all of your senses. And accompanied by distinct what we call action tendencies, or chances that you will behave a certain way. So one simple example is that you feel subjectively happy, and your action tendency is to smile, or to maybe hold yourself more upright than you normally would. So you act in a certain way based on the way that you feel, the emotion that you're experiencing. Because people are different in the way that they emotionally react to different events, different types of communication, emotions can be useful ways to look at and examine and distinguish different types of personalities. Now, this is just an overview of some emotion theories, and I want to note a few things. This first one that says common sense theory, that's just the name of the theory. It's no more common sense ideas than James Lange or Cannon-Bard or Sachter-Singer. It's just called that, so note that. And if you look at these first three, you'll notice that really it's just a matter of the theory shifting things around. So I've got the example of the stimulus is that you see a bear. You're out hiking, you see a bear, and in the common sense theory, you first feel fear, and you're afraid. And then you have this physiological response that follows that. So your heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, cortisol gets released, all those things that are stress-inducing, and then you have a behavioral response, which in the case of a bear, you might run, you might freeze up and tense up. Now, the James Lange theory flips that around and says, no, first your heart rate goes up when you see the bear, and blood pressure goes up, cortisol, all of those things happen. And then once you start to have those things ramp up, then you actually experience the emotion of fear, and you know that you're afraid. So they would say you're already beginning to run and behave a certain way before you're actually experiencing the fear. Now, the Cannon-Bard theory basically just combines those two and says, no, there's no way to really tease those apart. And that is the difficulty in this. And it's why we have several theories to explain it, is because we don't have any scientific way to perfectly prove any of these theories as being, perfectly more true than the other. So they're all reasonable explanations for how we experience emotions. The last one is interesting as well, because it takes those two components and wedges between them a cognitive appraisal. So what the last one is saying is that you're first going to see this bear and everything's going to ramp up and you're going to start to maybe run or move in a certain direction, but then you're going to start thinking about what's going on. And it's interesting because if you think about somebody who is a seasoned hiker or a survivalist who's been around bears lots in their life, when they start to assess the situation, sure, they'll see the bear, and seeing a wild animal that could hurt you is going to ramp up your systems. But if you're used to it, you're going to praise it and say, well, that's a male black bear. It doesn't have any cubs with it, so it's probably not much of a threat. And so your fear response is going to be lower than somebody who's never seen a bear in the wild and is just going to see it and think, bear, 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 and their cognition isn't going to have much of anything, and they're going to feel lots of fear. So these are different explanations for when things are happening in this process of feeling an emotion. Now, a couple sort of big ideas thinking about emotional states versus emotional traits. In emotional states, these are transitory, meaning they change, and they change relatively quickly. So you feel fear, and then it ends. You feel happy, and then that ends as well. So we can be in different emotional states. We can be in a good mood for a little bit or a bad mood for a little bit. These depend on the situations we're in. They depend on the type of person who's in that situation. And so an emotional state is just relative to the person or the situation that they're in. Now, emotional traits are consistent patterns that people have. So if someone is fearful of being in public situations, they will keep having that same fear response every time they're in a public situation. And maybe they have something like agoraphobia, where they just don't like being in public spaces where they feel trapped, or any space really where they feel trapped, and that might give them the fear response. But we can see these consistent things, and we would call this a trait then, an emotional trait. Now, a little bit more about how theorists see emotions. Some see them as distinct states that don't overlap, that are discrete, and they would argue, these types of theorists would argue, that when you feel anger, you feel just anger and nothing else, and that goes, and then you feel the next emotion. And one of the sort of classic examples is you're on a roller coaster and you're feeling fear and joy. Somebody who is working with discrete emotions would say that you're just oscillating back and forth between fear and joy. You're not experiencing them at the same time. Others would argue that it's more of a continuum, that these states flow into each other, and that you could be feeling a mix of fear and happiness at the same time. And both of these ways of thinking about and looking at emotions have validity in terms of scientific validity. And with this recognition that in general, some emotions are positive, some are negative, and some can be either of those things, depending upon the situation, depending upon the person, and depending upon cognition as well. Now, if we're looking at this categorical versus dimensional approach, so breaking this down into discrete categories, with the categorical approach, the focus is on finding discrete emotions, and in the case of these facial displays over here, finding discrete behavioral expressions or displays of those emotions. So this is referencing the work of Paul Ekman. These pictures actually come from a show called Lie to Me, which was, I saw it on Netflix, but it's just a TV show based on the work of Ekman. And what Ekman tried to figure out were these universal displays of emotions. And he did a pretty fair job of figuring out the way we move the muscles on our face when we feel different types of emotions. And he also did a fair job of looking at all different types of cultures, from very modernized Western cultures to tribes in Papua New Guinea, and found lots of similarities, and basically identified 7 different emotions that most people will display on their faces in similar ways. And you can see these different expressions of disgust, contempt, fear, anger, surprise, sadness, and the one that's missing here would be happiness, the 7th one. And again, in his view, and other theorists who are taking this categorical approach, they would say these are universal displays, and the feelings are the same. And so somebody approaching emotions from this perspective would be looking for sort of unifying theories about emotions. Now, the dimensional approach, rather than looking for these unifying categories, puts emotions on this wheel, basically, that I showed you in the earlier slide, where we move through different types of emotions. And the way they look for these different emotions is they have people rate themselves on different emotions. And then they use statistics to try to figure out what types of emotions people are saying they feel in the same types of situations. So they're trying to create these different dimensions based on arousal being high or low, and based on the emotion being pleasurable or displeasurable. And there is some consensus on those two axes, predicting lots of different emotions that lots of people self-report. So this model suggests that every feeling state is really a combination of this pleasantness, unpleasantness, and arousal, whether it's high or low. So every emotion we experience can be mapped out on these dimensions. Now, we can also think of emotions in our lives, and we can think of the content versus style. And content is referring to the kind of emotion that you experience. And is it negative? Is it positive? What is the actual content of that emotion? What's it related to? Style refers to how it's experienced. So what do you actually feel as you're going through that emotion? What does it feel like to be envious or to feel contempt towards someone or something, which is a really negative, strong emotion? But content and style are very trait-like. And we've talked a lot about traits of personality. But they're trait-light in the sense that they are stable over time and situations, so stable across time and across situations, and meaningful when we try to distinguish different types of people. So in that sense, we can use content and style almost as we use those different trait adjectives. So in terms of content, pleasant emotions, we often think of happiness and things that relate to satisfaction or well-being. And happiness is probably the main pleasant emotion, the one that we strive for to feel good. When we're happy, truly happy, we feel good. We feel satisfied with our lives or the moment that we're in. And researchers have defined over time happiness in two ways that are complementary, that work together. One is the judgment that your life has purpose and meaning. And this is basically known as the life satisfaction component, knowing that you have purpose and meaning. It could be in your work, it could be in your personal life. Usually it's a mix of both those things, though. And it's best when we have a balance, when we feel satisfaction in our work and in our personal life as well. Now, the other is looking at your positive emotions relative to your negative emotions. This is known as the hedonic component. So is the lion's share of your emotions more negative, or is the lion's share more positive? What is the balance between those? And most scholars would say you need to experience and get out negative emotions. You can't just bottle those in and never experience those at all. So oftentimes to get at these things, it's self-report, but non-self-report measures are used as well, so asking other people about someone else's emotional experiences. And these self-report and non-self-report measures of happiness correlate with self-report scores of social desirability. So there is something interesting about how if someone is high in the desire to be sort of accepted in society by other people, they tend to report more happiness. So people who like to interact more, it seems they tend to be able to find more happiness in life. So part of being happy, though, is having positive illusions about yourself. And it sounds odd, but to have an inflated view of your own characteristics as being good, or you being, able to do the things that you want to do, and being a person that other people like. So though it sounds odd that we can fool ourselves into being happy, we know from the data that we have that these things do help us feel happy, to sort of delude ourselves a little bit into thinking that we might be happier than what we are. Now, in terms of the content, some of the things that we know about happy people, we don't find sex differences in overall happiness or overall well-being, life satisfaction. We also don't find differences across cultures and countries. So in general, there doesn't seem to be a strong predictor based on zip code or country or biological sex or even gender. There's no evidence that there is age differences in overall happiness, although we know, talking about developmental psychology a little bit in this class, that as your circumstances change throughout your life, that could give you more or fewer opportunities for happiness. The ethnic group that you're in is unrelated to your own subjective feelings of well-being, so that is also not a great predictor of well-being. Some of the national differences that we see, if we look at different nations, where we see differences is not in just the borders, the country that you're in, the nation that you're in. Where we see differences is in people in poorer countries are less happy. And so money seems to be, or resources is perhaps a better word, seems to be related to happiness. So there's differences in terms of economic development of nations. This may be one of the big predictors of differences in subjective well-being across countries. So it might be a matter of how many resources countries have, or can distribute those resources well to the people in the country. Now, there's an interesting question: does money make people happy? And there's been quite a bit of research on this, and we know that wealthier countries have higher life satisfaction, but there's lots of variables that get in the way in terms of predicting happiness. And researchers try to address these this problem of multiple variables by looking, controlling for those variables and then looking across countries, looking at things like income and happiness. And there's interesting relationships that have been found between individual or family income and happiness. We know in very poor countries, economic status predicts happiness. However, there's this sort of threshold, and it's an interesting one. The latest work that I've seen from Daniel Kahneman essentially says that when your happiness continues to go up as you go from making zero income all the way up to about $70,000, and that's looking at the United States, and then it tapers off. And when you go above 70,000, happiness doesn't tend to increase anymore. So as your income increases, happiness increases till you hit about that $70,000 mark, and that's for families as well. So it seems like once you can take care of all your necessities and things like that, then happiness is predicated on other things other than income and the money that you have. Now, shifting towards this idea of personality and well-being and happiness, we know that people who are high in extroversion, low in neuroticism, seem to be more happy, and it seems to contribute more to happiness than all these other things that we think might be related, like gender, ethnicity, age, and pretty much any other demographic characteristic you can pull out of a hat. So when we think about the models, or trying to model statistically the relationship between personality and well-being, we have an indirect and a direct model. The indirect model says that personality causes a person to create the lifestyle they want, and the lifestyle that they create causes the emotional reaction. The direct model says personality causes emotional reactions. So indirect says it's your personality that gets you to set up your life in a certain way. And that setup is what gets you to feel different emotions. The direct model says, no, it is because you are a high extrovert that you are just going to feel more happiness. And so two different models that tend to work together in different types of ways. Now, some research by Larson and colleagues, specifically looking at that direct model, said that the best predictor of responsiveness to positive mood induction, so you go to a laboratory study and they try to induce a positive mood. They give you something good to eat, or they heap praise on you, or play lovely music that you like. The best predictor of how well you're going to respond to that is extroversion. The higher you are in extroversion, the easier it is for us in laboratories to get you to be in a positive mood, to induce a positive mood. The best predictor of responsiveness to a negative mood induction, so same scenario, now we want to put you in a negative mood, so we put a smell in a room or something like that. The best predictor of that is neuroticism. So the way to break this down is it seems like it's easier for us to put an extrovert into a good mood and somebody who's high in neuroticism into a bad mood. And all the studies are pointing in that same direction. So these two variables seem really important in terms of personality and well-being. And it would suggest and give support for this idea that there is a direct relationship between extroversion, neuroticism, and the emotions that you experience, that maybe it isn't indirect, maybe it isn't the lifestyle you build, or maybe the lifestyle is important, but maybe this has a more important effect. So a little bit more on these unpleasant emotions like anxiety or just negative affect in general, and how this relates to neuroticism. So somebody who's high in neuroticism is in general moody, touchy, irritable. These are all terms we use to describe them. Anxious, unstable, pessimistic, complaining. So being high in neuroticism is patently not good for your well-being. It's patently negative. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about Eysenck's biological theory of personality and how that related to traits. And in Eysenck's view, neuroticism is due to this tendency for the limbic system in the brain to be overactive. So somebody who, in Eysenck's view, is neurotic is somebody who has an overactive limbic system. And the limbic system is responsible for our basic fight or flight reaction to things. So if that system's overreactive, of course you're going to be moody, touchy, irritable, unstable, because that system itself is unstable. So Eysenck's arguments break down in this way in favor of a biological basis for neuroticism, saying it's baked into your biology. Eisnick would argue that neuroticism is stable over time, and quite stable over time. We know from the Big Five, which followed Eisnick's work on what could be referred to as the Big Three, neuroticism plays one of the major dimensions of personality and plays a role in all the theories that we've had moving past Eisnick. And neuroticism shows high levels of heritability, as in it travels through lineage. And so these are all arguments in favor of this being based in biology and physiology. Now, there are other theories that shift towards cognition. These are the cognitive theories. So neuroticism is caused by the way we process information. And, this is getting back to the Sachter-Singer model that I talked about, where you see the bear and you have a physiological response, but then you think about it. And the emotion is predicated on your cognition, the way you're thinking about things. So now we're on to those cognitive things where we have different ways of processing different types of scenarios. And you can imagine if you are someone who processes most things in a negative way, that's going to set you up to be more neurotic in general. So some of the explanations, people high in neuroticism basically have stronger or richer networks and schemas in their mind built up with associations surrounding certain emotions that are negative. So, you have built up in your mind this structure of things, and it's all built around negativity. Remember that cognition and cognitive psychologists are interested in what's called your schema, the way you built up all the ideas in your mind in a certain network, and how do they all connect together in different types of ways, and are they connected well, or do we need to sort of restructure that and try to help you, reconnect different types of things. So in this case, the unpleasant things are more easily accessible. They're always front and center. Whatever it is you start to think about, it's connected to something negative. So your mind starts to think about something even slightly positive, but for you, it's still connected to something negative in your mind. So your mind goes there, and then your body goes there, and you start to feel it as well. So one type of unpleasant information that we get is about our health, and for most people, that has a negative impact in general. Getting information about your health deteriorating or something just bad about your health, unpleasant information. People who are high in neuroticism are likely in these cases to recall many more instances of illness and bodily complaints when they're given information about poor health in the moment. So in their minds, their poor health is connected to lots and lots of negativity. Whereas the average person who's, maybe average in neuroticism or low in neuroticism doesn't have that same connection or those same connections and doesn't react, therefore, in the same way. So the major disease categories have little relation to neuroticism. Neuroticism is related to diminished immune functioning during stress. So people who are highly neurotic tend to have lower immune functioning, and we tend to see that in general. People who are under stress or duress, their immune system gets suppressed, and that's sort of across the board for any type of stress. Now, there's some research that talks about attentional theory, and this says that people who are high in neuroticism pay more attention to things like threats and unpleasant information in their environments. So perceptually, they're paying more attention to the negativity around them than somebody who's not so high in neuroticism. And that is also a cognitive thing where they're thinking about what it is they want to pay attention to and what it is they're going to filter out. Now, some other moods and emotion things that we feel, depressive states, melancholy, things that make us feel sad or down. One way to think about depressive states and melancholy or sadness is using the Diathis stress model. And this model says that we begin with a pre-existing something in our physiology, a vulnerability. But that doesn't emerge until we are in some situation that makes that emerge. So you might have depressive genes that have traveled through your lineage, but that won't emerge unless you're in a really stressful environment maybe for a long period of time. Maybe you have parents that have substance abuse issues, and that sort of stress brings out those depressive symptoms. So that's what this model is saying, that we have these pre-existing conditions, but that the actual negative diagnosable condition won't emerge until you're in the right environment or under the right stress. Beck goes further with his cognitive theory to say that there are certain cognitive styles where it's like a pre-existing condition. You are vulnerable because of the way you tend to think about things. And so it's almost like having a physiological pre-existing condition, but it's more of a psychological pre-existing condition where you are just constantly looking at things in a very negative way and thinking about them in very negative ways. And Beck has a whole list of ways that we tend to think overly negative or in ways that will push us into negative states. So the vulnerability there is in your cognitive schema, the way that you've designed the ideas in your mind, the way you've learned things, and the way you've decided to figure out looking at the world. Now, another emotion we feel is anger, and hostility often follows from that. Verbal aggression, physical aggression. We know that some people are more hostile than others, and they're hostile in response to the same situations. So when we test people, we put them in the same types of situations. We know frustration makes people angry, but at different rates and for different people, which is interesting. So hostility, by definition, is really the tendency to respond to everyday frustrations with anger and aggression. So again, verbal aggression or physical aggression. So you're easily irritated. Another word for that is irascible. People who are irascible are easily irritated, quick to get angry, or to act rude, to be critical, antagonistic, uncooperative, in just normal everyday interactions. Chronic hostility is also correlated to type A behavior. And again, this makes sense that people who want things to be a certain way and they're not tend to get more frustrated easily. And also there's a relationship between feeling this hostility, being a type A person, and having more heart disease problems and any of those symptoms that are related to heart disease tend to increase when you have chronic hostility and coincides as well with that type A behavior. Now we can also think of emotions as style throughout our life. So emotional content is the what of a person's emotional life. What is actually happening? Style is the how does the emotional life occur. So we can think of affect intensity. So how intense do you experience emotions? So high affect intensity people will experience emotions strongly and tend to be reactive to their emotions and tend to be a little bit more on the neurotic side where their reactions are variable. So they have a high intense reaction. Low affect intensity people experience emotions more mildly and with more gradual fluctuations and more minor reactions to things. Now the last thing I want to talk about is this interaction between content and style in our emotional life. And again, I mentioned hedonic is pleasant or unpleasant, and we try to balance those positive and negative emotions. And in a good, healthy life, we do have a balance between the positive and negative emotions. Now, affect intensity is the style of the emotional life, and again, that's the strength of your emotional reactions. So, hedonic balance and affect intensity are unrelated, but they interact with each other to produce these specific types of emotional lives that fit for different types of personalities. And we see patterns, and we can identify these patterns by looking at the interaction between content and style. And there's a lovely little chart here that basically puts those on the X and Y axis here, where we have on the Y axis frequent positive affect versus frequent negative affect. Affect, remember, is just emotion or feeling. And then we have low affect intensity, low emotion intensity, high affect intensity, high emotional intensity. And we have these 4 different personality styles, behaviors, and traits that fit with these combinations. So it's interesting to see, where you might fit on this really basic and simple continuum of intensity and frequent positive or negative affect. Now, to summarize things, we can think of our emotions as being states where, in a given day, I might be really sad, and I might be in that state because something sad happened. But maybe as a trait, I'm a generally happy person, and I don't get sad very often. So I could be in a state of sadness, but have the trait of general happiness. Emotional content, these are the types of emotional experiences that a person is likely to have, and the emotional style is the way that you experience those emotions. What does it feel like, and what happens as you experience that? And as I just showed, that content and style interact. And these are what really give us these four pictures of different types of emotional lives that people tend to experience, which yokes very closely to different personality styles. So emotional style is the typical way that a person experiences an emotion and displays that emotion as well. All right, that's all for this chapter. I will see you for our next chapter.